In defence planning, the most dangerous warning is not failure, but the quiet admission that something is only partly effective, because that is where systems begin to crack under their own ambition. Over the past week, a new audit from the Australian National Audit Office has done exactly that, placing a sharp spotlight on one of the Australian Army's most important modernisation efforts, the Land 400 Phase 3 program, a project valued at approximately 7.3 billion Australian dollars and designed to replace the ageing M113 fleet with a new generation infantry fighting vehicle. At first glance, nothing appears fundamentally broken. The program continues, the selected platform remains in place, and the Army's long-term capability roadmap is intact. But the audit introduces a far more unsettling question. Not whether Australia has chosen the wrong vehicle, but whether it is buying that vehicle in the right way. This distinction matters because Land 400 Phase 3 is not just another acquisition. It sits at the centre of a broader transformation in how Australia prepares for future conflict, moving from a relatively light expeditionary force towards a more networked, survivable, and high-end combat-capable land force. The audit's conclusion that the program is only partly effective signals that while the destination may still be achievable, the pathway is under strain. And that strain is not about engineering or battlefield performance. It is about cost discipline, governance clarity, and risk control. In simple terms, and the auditors are saying that Australia is trying to field a modern fighting system using a procurement framework that is not yet fully aligned with the complexity of that ambition. For viewers, the stakes are significant. This is not just about replacing an older armoured vehicle. It is about whether the Army can deliver protected mobility, integrated sensors, and survivability for infantry in a future environment where information, speed, and coordination matter as much as armour and firepower. And the timing of this audit could not be more critical because Australia is simultaneously embarking on multiple high-value defence programs, from advanced helicopters to submarine partnerships, all of which rely on the same underlying acquisition system. If that system shows weakness here in a program already well advanced, and then it raises broader questions about how resilient it will be under even greater pressure. So the real story behind this audit is not a simple headline about a vehicle program under scrutiny. It is a deeper signal that Australia is entering a phase where defence capability is no longer limited by intent or funding, but by the discipline of execution. And that leads to the central question for this video. Is this audit a minor course correction in a complex program? Or is it the first visible sign that Australia's defence procurement model must evolve quickly to match the strategic realities it is now trying to face? To understand why this audit carries so much weight, it is necessary to step back and look at what this program is actually trying to achieve inside the Australian Army, because this is not a simple vehicle replacement, and it is a structural shift in how land forces operate in the 21st century. For decades, the M113 has served as the backbone of Australia's mechanised infantry capability, a platform that was reliable for its time, but designed for a very different era of warfare, one where protection, connectivity, and battlefield awareness were far less demanding than they are today. As regional security dynamics evolve and the Australian Defence Force aligns itself more closely with high-end coalition operations, the expectation is no longer just mobility, but survivability, integration, and the ability to operate as part of a fully networked combat system. This is where the infantry fighting vehicle becomes central, not as a standalone asset, but as a node within a broader architecture that links sensors, communications, and command systems into a unified operational picture. Land 400. Phase 3 is therefore positioned as one of the most critical capability upgrades in the Army's modern history, designed to ensure that infantry units can move, observe, and respond in environments where information moves faster than traditional decision cycles. The selection of the Redback platform reflects this shift, offering advanced protection systems, modern sensors, and the capacity to integrate with future battlefield technologies, all of which are intended to give Australian forces a higher degree of resilience and awareness. However, this level of sophistication also introduces a new layer of complexity, because the value of such a system is not just measured by the vehicle itself, but by how well it is integrated, sustained, and adapted over time. That means the program is not simply about delivering hardware, it is about building a long-term capability ecosystem that includes training, maintenance, industrial support, and continuous upgrades. This is precisely why the audit's findings matter, because when a program reaches this level of complexity, even small weaknesses in cost estimation, governance, or risk management can scale into significant challenges over the life of the project. In practical terms, this is the difference between a capability that performs as intended for decades and one that requires constant adjustment to stay within budget or schedule. The broader implication is that Land 400 Phase 3 is effectively a test case for how Australia manages complex and high-value defence acquisitions in an era where technological integration and operational demands are increasing at the same time. It sits at the intersection of strategy, industry, and military capability, meaning that its success or failure will influence not just the Army's future, but the confidence placed in Australia's entire defence procurement system. And that is why the audit does not simply raise questions about a single program. It forces a closer examination of whether the structures in place today are ready to support the scale and ambition of the capabilities Australia is now seeking to build. When the audit describes the program as only partly effective, it is not a vague or symbolic statement. It is a precise technical judgment that points directly to three structural weaknesses in how the program has been managed. And understanding these weaknesses is essential to understanding why this matters at a national level. The first issue lies in cost estimation, specifically the way the program calculated and validated its long-term financial profile. Because modern combat vehicles are no longer simple assets with predictable upkeep. They are complex systems that require continuous sustainment, upgrades, and integration over decades. And the audit found that the costing models used did not fully capture the total life cycle cost with sufficient confidence, relying in part on assumptions that were not strongly supported by comparable data or independently verified benchmarks. This creates a situation where the headline figure of approximately $7.3 billion may not reflect the full financial burden over time, and raising the risk that future governments could face cost pressures that force difficult trade-offs between capability, quantity, and readiness. The second issue centres on governance, which in this context refers to how decisions are made, documented, and justified throughout the acquisition process. And the audit highlights that some key decisions were not consistently supported by clear, traceable records, meaning that the rationale behind critical steps in the selection and evaluation process cannot always be independently verified with full transparency. In a program of this scale, governance is not just administrative discipline, it is the mechanism that ensures accountability, maintains confidence among stakeholders, and protects the integrity of the decision-making process. And any weakness in this area increases the risk that decisions may drift over time under pressure from competing priorities or external influences. The third issue involves risk management, and this is where the audit's findings become particularly important because it suggests that certain risks related to technology, integration, schedule, and program execution were not identified early enough or managed with a sufficiently proactive approach, instead being addressed after they began to materialise. In complex defence programs, risk is not an exception, it is a constant, and the ability to anticipate and mitigate risk before it impacts cost or schedule is one of the defining characteristics of a mature acquisition system. Taken together, these three issues do not indicate that the program is failing, but they do indicate that the system managing the program is operating below optimal performance at a time when the stakes are unusually high. The critical insight here is that none of these findings directly question the capability of the vehicle itself, but rather the processes that bring that capability into service. And in a modern military environment where speed, integration, and sustainability are as important as raw performance, The effectiveness of those processes can ultimately determine whether a capability delivers on its promise or becomes constrained by the very system designed to deliver it. At this point, the discussion moves beyond the mechanics of a single program and into a more uncomfortable question, because if the vehicle itself is not the problem, then the focus shifts to the system that produced these outcomes, and that is where the real strategic weight of the audit begins to emerge. What becomes clear is that this is not an isolated issue tied to one project team or one procurement decision, but a reflection of a broader transition that the Australian Defence Establishment is currently undergoing, moving from a force designed primarily for limited expeditionary operations toward one that must be capable of operating in high-intensity, technology-driven environments alongside major partners. That transition introduces a level of complexity that stretches existing acquisition frameworks, because it demands not just the purchase of advanced platforms, but the integration of those platforms into a cohesive, networked capability that can evolve over time. In practical terms, this means the system must simultaneously manage technological uncertainty, industrial coordination, long-term sustainment, and financial discipline, all while maintaining transparency and accountability. The audit findings suggest that the current system is still adapting to that reality, and that adaptation process is producing friction. This is what can be described as a transition shock, where the ambition of the capability is moving faster than the maturity of the processes that support it. It is important to understand that this pattern is not unique. Other defence organisations have experienced similar challenges when scaling up to more complex acquisition environments. But the key difference lies in how quickly and effectively those challenges are addressed. For Australia, the stakes are amplified by the fact that multiple major programs are advancing at the same time, each one relying on the same underlying procurement architecture. If that architecture is not fully aligned with the demands being placed upon it, then the risks identified in this program could begin to appear elsewhere, not because of individual failures, but because of systemic limitations. This creates a situation where the audit is less about assigning responsibility and more about revealing capacity, specifically the capacity of the system to deliver consistently under pressure. It also reframes the conversation about capability, because the question is no longer limited to what the Army will receive in terms of equipment, but extends to how reliably that equipment can be delivered, sustained, and adapted over its operational life. In that sense, the findings act as an early signal, highlighting areas where improvement is required before the full weight of future programs begins to test the system even further. And this is where the strategic interpretation becomes unavoidable, because the effectiveness of a defence force in the modern era is not determined solely by the quality of its platforms, but by the strength of the process that bring those platforms into service and keep them relevant over time. And it is precisely those processes that are now under scrutiny. This leads directly to the question that matters most for anyone following the program closely, whether the platform itself is now at risk, and the answer requires a clear separation between two different layers of the story. It's the performance of the vehicle and the performance of the system acquiring it. On the technical side, there is no indication from the audit that the vehicle has failed to meet its intended role or that its core design is flawed. And that distinction is critical because modern acquisition programs often become politically sensitive when technical performance is questioned, but that is not what is happening here. The platform remains aligned with the Army's requirement for a protected network-capable infantry fighting vehicle that can operate within a combined arms environment, and its design philosophy reflects the broader shift toward survivability, situational awareness, and integration with future systems. This means that from a capability perspective, the foundation of the program remains intact. And there is no immediate trigger for cancellation based on the findings that have been released. However, the audit does introduce pressure in a different direction, one that focuses on how the program will be managed going forward rather than whether it should exist at all. In practical terms, this creates a set of likely adjustments that are more subtle but still significant, starting with the possibility of revisiting the cost baseline to ensure that future spending aligns more closely with realistic projections. This could lead to changes in how the program phases its funding, how it prioritizes certain capabilities within the vehicle, or how it structures long-term sustainment agreements. Another area of potential adjustment is the delivery timeline, because when risk management processes are strengthened, it often results in more conservative scheduling to account for uncertainties that may not have been fully captured earlier in the program. This does not necessarily mean major delays, but it does increase the likelihood of incremental shifts that extend the overall timeline in order to maintain control over cost and integration challenges. A third factor that cannot be ignored is quantity. Because in many defence programs, when financial pressure increases, one of the most common responses is to reduce the number of units acquired in order to keep the total budget within acceptable limits. While there is no formal indication that such a decision has been made, the structural issues identified in the audit create the conditions under which that option may be considered in future reviews. Taken together, these dynamics suggest that the program is not entering a phase of cancellation, but rather a phase of recalibration, where the emphasis shifts from selection to execution, and where the primary objective becomes ensuring that the capability can be delivered in a way that is sustainable over its entire life cycle. This is a familiar pattern in complex defence acquisitions, where the most challenging period often begins after the initial decision has been made, because that is when the system must prove that it can translate strategic intent into practical outcomes without losing control of cost, schedule, or performance. And it is precisely that transition that is now unfolding. As the program moves into this recalibration phase, the implications extend far beyond a single capability and begin to shape how Australia will approach defence acquisition in the years ahead. Because what is being tested now is not just execution, but institutional adaptability under pressure. The most immediate consequence is likely to be a tightening of procurement discipline, with greater emphasis placed on independent cost validation, clearer decision traceability, and earlier identification of program risks, all of which are designed to prevent the kinds of gaps highlighted in the audit from expanding as the program progresses. This does not represent a fundamental shift in strategic intent, but it does signal a change in how that intent will be implemented, with more structured oversight and a stronger focus on aligning ambition with deliverable outcomes. Beyond this program, the effects are expected to ripple across other major initiatives, particularly those that involve high levels of technological integration and long-term investment, because they rely on the same underlying systems of governance and financial control. If improvements are made here, they can strengthen confidence across the entire portfolio. But if similar issues persist, they could introduce cumulative risk into multiple areas of capability development at the same time. There is also an important industrial dimension to consider, as the success of this program is closely linked to the development of domestic production and sustainment capacity. And any adjustments to cost, schedule, or quantity have the potential to influence workforce planning, supply chain stability, and the broader objective of building a resilient national defence industry. In this sense, the program operates at the intersection of military capability and economic strategy, making its trajectory relevant not only to the Army, but to the national approach to defence preparedness as a whole. Looking ahead over the next 12 to 24 months, the most likely outcome is a continuation of the program with refined controls, where progress is measured not just by milestones achieved, but by the consistency and reliability of the process that support those milestones. This period will effectively serve as a proving ground for whether the adjustments made in response to the audit are sufficient to stabilise execution and maintain alignment with long-term objectives. And the broader lesson that emerges is that modern defence capability is no longer defined solely by what is acquired, but by how effectively it is delivered, integrated and sustained over time, and that places increasing importance on the systems that manage complexity rather than the platforms themselves. In that context, the significance of this moment becomes clear, because it represents an early opportunity for Australia to refine its approach before the full scale of future programs places even greater demands on the system, and the extent to which those refinements succeed will play a central role in determining how confidently the nation can pursue its defence ambitions in an increasingly complex strategic environment.